Alright guys, welcome back to Underground Science, and in this video we'll be going over another type of anemia known as glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency anemia. Alright, so I don't think I wrote that in the title. Yeah, no I didn't, but it's a deficiency anemia, alright? But our main topic is the glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase enzyme. Okay, so first let's go ahead and talk about this glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase enzyme, alright? So remember in our glycolysis videos, right, we said that regularly, so when glucose entered inside our cells, right, we regularly went to glucose, and then we saw that it turned into glucose 6-phosphate, right? So remember we used an ATP in this step, right? So we used an ATP in this step, and then we said that we ended up with adenosine diphosphate and a phosphate group. And then this phosphate group actually went to the 6th carbon, so which is why it became glucose 6-phosphate. And then we said that it would go to fructose 6-phosphate, right? So fructose 6-phosphate. Let me just go and write it out. Fructose 6-phosphate, and then we said that it would go to fructose 1,6-bisphosphate, and then it would split through aldolase enzymes into dihydroxyacetylene phosphate, glycerolidine 3-phosphate, and all of that. But what happens is that we actually have another pathway that our cells can take that we'll talk about in a future video or a future playlist. It's called the pentose phosphate pathway. All right, so it's also a very interesting pathway. All right, and some of the products and compounds that are produced in this pentose phosphate pathway is going to be the same as some of the products or compounds produced in glycolysis. All right, so what happens is that the pentose phosphate pathway actually starts with the glucose 6-phosphate. So what can happen, so let's go and bring the pentose phosphate pathway here. We're not going to talk about it in this video. We'll talk about it in a future playlist, but we're just going to talk about the products that involve our glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase enzyme. So let's go and start here. So we have our glucose 6-phosphate, right? So our glucose 6-phosphate over here. And so what can happen in the pentose phosphate pathway? It happens mostly in the liver, because what we'll see here is we actually lead to a production of a really important compound that actually plays a role in detoxification and xenobiotic metabolism and all that in the liver, and drug metabolism. It's going to be called NADPH. So I forgot the D, so I'm just going to fix that real quick. NADPH. All right, that's one of the main goals also of the pentose phosphate pathway. Other than there's also other goals also, but this is one of the main goals too, to produce NADPH, because we actually have antioxidants that need NADPH in order to keep on producing their effects, right, on bad free radicals in our body, right? So like reactive oxygen species and other types of drugs and other types of xenobiotics. All right, so it's mostly done in the liver. All right, so the pentose phosphate pathway. So our liver can take that glucose and shuttle it through our pentose phosphate pathway to make our NADPH and then go back to glycolysis. All right, so our pentose phosphate, so our liver can take that glucose and shuttle it through our pentose phosphate pathway if it needs more of this NADPH, and we'll see why we need this NADPH. So our pentose phosphate pathway starts with glucose 6-phosphate, and then from glucose 6-phosphate we go to, let me go and just draw this arrow bigger so we'll need to talk about the enzyme, right? So from glucose 6-phosphate, right, it's not like glycolysis anymore. Like glycolysis went to fructose 6-phosphate, right? But here, from glucose 6-phosphate, we go to glucano 1,5, all right, glucano 1,5 lactone 6-phosphate. All right, so glucano 1,5 lactone 6-phosphate. So it's kind of a weird big name, but that's what's produced after glucose 6-phosphate. And now the enzyme that does this reaction, this specific reaction right here, that's the catalyst, right? So the enzyme that lowers this activation energy in the specific reaction is going to be called glucose glucose-6-phosphate dehydrogenase. Now, why is it dehydrogenase? Because we didn't mention one thing. It's glucose-6-phosphate dehydrogenase also catalyzes a reaction of that pretty much ends up reducing NADP+. Okay, so what also happens in this step, guys, is that we have a NADP+ molecule that actually gets reduced and turns into NADPH. So that means glucose-6-phosphate gets oxidized, right? And we have our glucose-6-phosphate dehydrogenase enzyme doing this. And notice we're producing NADPH, all right? So let's be careful and notice that. So this is pretty much the main thing that the main two reactions, or the two steps that we have to talk about. Again, we'll talk about the pentose phosphate pathway as a whole in our future playlist. But so far, right now, we just have to know this, all right? So what do these NADPH molecules eventually do, all right? So pretty much, just a quick overview is that when we produce these NADPH molecules, right? If we take an example of our liver cells, in our liver we have many antioxidants, and the main antioxidant that we have is going to be called glutathione, all right? So glutathione. And so glutathione is an amazing antioxidant that's abundant in our liver because, as our liver needs to do a lot of metabolism and has to break down a lot of bad toxic things like, drugs and other xenobiotics, right? So let's go and label this as a very important antioxidant, all right? So now what glutathione does is that it tries to pretty much reduce reactive oxygen species. All right, so what do I mean by that? So let's say remember we even talked about in our COVID playlist where we saw that those neutrophils that came in the alveoli, right, started to release many reactive oxygen species. Like we said, some could be hydrogen peroxide. We said some could be the superoxide anion. We said it could be things like the hypochlorous acid. We said it could be the peroxide anion, right? It could also be the hydroxyl group, right? So these are known as some of the many reactive oxygen species. So it's known as the reactive oxygen species, and they act like free radicals. And we don't want free radicals because it can cause destruction to our cells, all right, in our body. So what glutathione does is that it ends up pretty much reducing some of these dangerous reactive oxygen species. All right, so glutathione acts as a reducing agent. So glutathione acts like a reducing agent and reduces the crap out of some of these bad reactive oxygen species. Like, for example, it could add a hydrogen to here, right? And it could end up either turning this dangerous hydroxyl group into water, right? It can do that, and if it can't do that, then it'll try to add a hydrogen, right, and reduce some of these hydrogen peroxide reactive oxygen species, turning these into water, right, into many water molecules. So we're actually running out of space. Let me go and write it here. So try to turn this into water, and it can do that through its reduction mechanism. So it can reduce some of these reactive oxygen species, free radicals, to make them into less dangerous things like water, right? Water's not dangerous compared to these free radicals and reactive oxygen species. But when it does that, so when our glutathione, right, reduces that and acts on these reactive oxygen species, the glutathione can then turn into the oxidized form, right? So then we're going to have glutathione in its oxidized form. So now glutathione is going to be oxidized, all right? But then we need something to reduce so now we need something to reduce the oxidized glutathione, because that's how glutathione is going to work. It's going to reduce some of these reactive oxygen species. If it reduces this, that means glutathione itself is getting oxidized, right? So that means glutathione is getting oxidized. But then we need glutathione in its reduced form, not in the oxidized form, right? If we have glutathione as reduced form, then only can glutathione reduce and make these reactive oxygen species less dangerous. So once glutathione gets in its oxidized form, we need NADPH's help. What NADPH is going to do, it's going to come here. So like, I got you, right? And it's gonna reduce glutathione back to its reduced form, which means NADPH is going to turn into NADP positive, right? So that's where we need that's where we need NADPH for. That's why we need NADPH for. That's one of the many reasons, right? We need NADPH to reduce the oxidized form of glutathione, so then glutathione can come back to the reduced form and get rid of some of these reactive oxygen species, right? These dangerous reactive oxygen species. So what's going to happen now? So let's go back up and see what we're trying to talk about. The glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency anemia. Let's go back here into the pentose phosphate pathway at the beginning. We see the enzyme right here. What is this enzyme driving? Like, what reaction is it driving? First, we saw that it was driving glucose 6-phosphate to glucono-1,5-lactone 6-phosphate. We also saw it's driving the reaction, or it's driving the reaction where we make an NADPH or a NADPH molecule. But what happens if we're deficient in this enzyme? Can we make enough NADPH molecules? No, right? So that means that we won't be able to have enough NADPH molecules to help our glutathione antioxidant to keep on continuously performing its function by making these reactive oxygen species less dangerous. So what's going to end up happening in this type of anemia is, let's go on a different page, right? It's getting too full. So what's going to happen is that these reactive oxygen species can start to build up, right? Because we don't have enough of the reduced form of glutathione, because we don't have enough NADPH because of the glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency, right? So these reactive oxygen species can start building up and can actually go to our red blood cells, can go to our red blood cells, and then we'll actually go and start to destroy, right, the reactive oxygen species will. So we'll start to destroy the hemoglobin, all right, which will actually end up destroying the red blood cell also a little bit at least. And so the destruction of the hemoglobin will then lead to decreased oxygen carrying capacity, right? We won't be able to carry that much oxygen in those red blood cells because hemoglobin is where oxygen binds. So decreased oxygen will be able to bind to hemoglobin, making oxyhemoglobin, right? So that's why, because we have less functional hemoglobin, we're going to end up with glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase, right? So glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency anemia. All right, this is why it's classified as a type of anemia. So deficiency anemia. All right, so that's it. So that's what I wanted to get through in this video, is how these reactive oxygen species build up due to the lack of our glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase enzyme, right, and can actually go to our red blood cells and start to break apart our hemoglobin and actually destroy it, which means that less oxygen can be carried in our red blood cells, which can then lead to a type of anemia called glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency anemia. All right, guys, so that's what I wanted to get through in this video. I really hope this video wasn't too boring, or I hope this video made sense to you guys. I hope to see you guys in my future videos. We'll talk about more cool topics about biochem, physics, and chem. Don't forget to hit that notification bell, like, and subscribe. See you guys later, and stay safe.